The natural mind in all of us as humanity is generally this living from our desires. We think that pleasing our desires and getting what we want is the way to navigate life. And we don't think that there's really much danger in this unless our desires are particularly horrid, those types of things. Generally, to our natural mind, we think that living from our desires is a safe thing to do. But what God is showing us in the scriptures is how living from our desires is the very heart of what corrupts man and deceives us. Because, for one, we think that living from our desires is a way to have a meaningful life. And we also think that living from our desires is not going to endanger us from living to a true morality, a true goodness in the pursuit of our desires. And we think that living for our desires is not really that harmful. We're not getting in other people's ways. We're just pursuing what we want, and that this isn't wrong and this is benign. The problem with this is that we are judging by our desires, and we are ultimately judging by self as law. So whatever gets me my desires, whatever benefits me, and I mean this not in just extreme senses of profit and money, but whatever we think this is like to our benefit, is the law of what is good, and is the law of how to live our life and pursue things. Now, what gets mixed with this is that we need the law of self-preservation. We need the law of a certain type of self-love, a self-love that is really looking to our good. But the sinful heart is that we are living after our desires, and so many times we're living for our desires. We're living for a type of self-love that's actually to our detriment. It's going against our health. It's going against our well-being. And the thing that blinds us to our well-being is actually this intense pursuit of self, this intense pursuit of our ambitions or our plans or our romantic desires or our whatever relational desires we want. And we live in a way that we're so adamantly pursuing those things that we do these things to a detriment to ourselves and to others around us. All of us are living in a way of there is a law over us. There's a law that is directing and dictating our life. And for all of us, it can only be one thing. So when we have our desires as the course to our life, this is what we're following. This is what we believe in. So Jesus says, follow me, and have the law of Christ over us, have Jesus as Lord. What is the opposite of this in sinful men is that we have the law of self as our government. We have our desires as what we follow, and this is the way that we follow after. And so ultimately we're making self and our desires and our pleasing our desires the law of our life. This is what we think is meaningful. This is what mankind thinks is meaningful. And God is showing us that the opposite of this is to live under the law of his kingdom and righteousness, the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Now, this does not mean that we don't have desires. This doesn't mean that God is directing us to live in such an intense serving of God that we are beyond our strength, that we're overspending ourselves, which is what this is often translated to be. Oh, live for God and go and overexert yourself and exhaust yourself and live miserably. But the true service of God is that we don't live from the law of self. We don't live from the law of simply whatever I'm desiring, but we live underneath the law of righteousness. We live underneath the law of what is truly good. And now we are slaves to those things. We are slaves to what is really right. So instead of, an exchange that I'm having with a person where my profit is the aim, whatever I get, if I can win this competition, for example, and I win, this prize, that's all that matters. Instead of that being the mentality that I'm living in, now I'm living for the mentality of what is good for everyone, including myself, what is good for everyone, what is fair to everyone, and what ultimately acknowledges God and gives glory back to God. Because living for the glory of God is not living in this activity, in this intense service all the time, which is exactly what so many people translate it to be. It's living with a mindset of viewing how everything reflects on God. So if I live selfishly as a Christian, how does that reflect upon the glory of God? It's always living from a view of God, living from a view of trusting God, living from a view of, who God truly is, and an acknowledgement of God. All of these different ways, that is living underneath the law of God. And underneath that law, ultimately, what's right and what's fair, and having that fear of God to not set aside those things, but now to acknowledge those things and to know that I can't live in a way that's compromising other people. And the opposite of this is that we are completely outside of that. We are living from our desires. We're living from whatever plan we kind of draw out of a hat. We live after our ambitions. We live after pride and conceit, and we live after these false glories of this life. And we're not living to the true glory of Christ and his kingdom. And we're trusting in these things of the world to give us meaning. We're trusting in the fulfilling of a romantic desire or a career or, fame or whatever these things are. We're trusting in those things to give us meaning, to give us, this satisfaction. But God is showing that the true path of meaning is to live beneath the law of Christ. And what Jesus is doing through the gospel is replacing that law of self, that law of however we wish to live, with the law of righteousness. If we look at Romans 6, this is what it talks about. You have become slaves of righteousness. Now we are no longer slaves of our desires. We're not meant to live in that way of being a slave to our ambitions or our conceit or whatever our desires are living by. And those desires are what deceives us. They direct the entire course of our life, and we think that it's safe. That's the deception. We think that it's safe, but all of these things, whatever our desires are, they can be as small as I want to live in the woods in a shack and not be separate from society and live off the grid, or it can be I want to get millions and have this great corporation, whatever it is. When we live from that trust of our desires, the danger is how that will deceive us. And we are no longer living from the slavery of righteousness, but living from the slavery of our desires. And this is what Jesus being Lord means. It means that we are beneath the law of Christ. We are being ruled by the law of Christ. We are living for what is good instead of just whatever desires come into our fancy. In 2 Corinthians 5:15, it says, "And he died for all, that those who live might no longer live for themselves, but for him who for their sake died and was raised." It's that opposite of what we live for. And what we live for is what we are ruled by. It's what we trust in. It's what we are following. It's what's Lord over us, what is the law on us.